I feel really thankful to know Drew, Abdulhamid, Vivek, and Heejae from their times when they were students at the Graduate School of Business and at the various early stages of thinking about the world they wanted to create and the opportunity that was at hand, kind of at the moment that they were getting ready to jump back into the world. And each of them found really thoughtful and insightful kind of points of leverage where they have jumped in to try to make a difference in on an issue that they know really deeply. So when they give their introductions, you'll get to hear a bit about like the kind of point of view that they are bringing to the work that they do and how they're applying AI technology to accelerate or amplify or reach kind of provide nuances in education in ways that were not possible before. I think we're also going to really try to dig into some of the hard things, like where should the limits be? Are we going too fast? What are the risks about how people are relating to each other that we need to be thinking about and be mindful too? So I'm going to try to be provocative. These folks know me, and I think that anything that I say, you have to know comes with a lot of respect and love for you. But I'll try to pull out tensions and make it spicy and interesting for you as listeners. And I'm also going to try to keep an eye on the Q&A so that if you have questions, I can't guarantee we'll get to them right away, but we'll try to have it be kind of as interactive as possible. And it's fantastic to see. Can people see the poll results as they're coming in? Anyone can tell me. Anyway, I'll just narrate. We have currently about 42% alumni. There are 24 of you in the room. 32% are students. 18 of you are currently in the room at the GSB, a few students from other Stanford schools, a few staff members, and some members of the public. And it's just fantastic to have you. In the registration information, I saw that the majority of folks who are coming kind of consider themselves either beginners or intermediate levels of kind of awareness about how AI applies in education. There were a few folks who considered themselves experts or advanced users, and interestingly, some of those folks signal that they also had the most caution about this space. And so we're just excited to have the conversation. So to start, first of all, my panelists, do each of you have somewhere near you a piece of paper and a pen that you can use when I prompt you to do so? Shake no or give me a thumbs down if you can't do that. But I'm going to try to kind of lock you into an assessment here that that the audience is also having a chance to think about. And I'm going to try and kind of structure the introductions in a way that is a little bit time bound and a little bit fun, but time bound just in that I want you to have a chance to introduce yourself, explain to the audience like what you're working on and why it matters to you. But then on this question, and I think this will set you up to talk about what you're doing, I want you to answer, to rate on a scale of 0 to 10, kind of how you're thinking about the potential of AI. So 0 will equal AI is all hype and will have no real impact on education outcomes. That's a 0. And 10 on that scale is going to be AI can solve all the gaps in education, especially for those most in need. And so take a minute and, on your little piece of paper, here I've got like a Post-it pad in front of me. Let's say that I was a 5, write down your number, turn it over, and then we're gonna have everybody reveal their number at the same time. And then one by one, I'll call on you to introduce yourself with your name, what you're up to, and then the number you chose and why. Like, what are the factors that are kind of driving the way that you are thinking about the potential for AI? Okay, so panelists, please take a moment. Think about that prompt and write down your number on your piece of paper. And then I'm going to count to 3 and you'll hold up your number in front of your face so that we can see it. That means that you can't change. You're stuck with the number that you wrote down and you're going to have to justify it. Okay. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I think you have to hold it up to your face because of the way the background works. So TJ, I see a 7. Block your face. A 4 for you, Viv, a 3 for you, Abdulhamid, and Drew, I can't see it. Hold it closer to your face. Still can't see. You want to read it? Oh, there. What did you write? I can't see it. Oh, and you're muted.
A 7.
A 7. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Drew, let's start with you since I couldn't see it until last. So would you please introduce yourself and then
Sure.
Explain your work a little bit and your number and why?
Great. Yeah. So hey, everyone. So Drew Barvir, co-founder and CEO of Sonar Mental Health, as Amanda alluded to, was a GSB alumni, graduated in 23, was also very fortunate to be a SIF fellow, which really helped to launch Sonar post-graduation. Um, in terms of what Sonar does, so we are really trying to be the connective tissue between schools, providers, and families around mental and behavioral health. So we offer 24/7 chat-based support, which is really human-led, and we'll probably get a lot more into the details of that, but we use AI to help to scale in a very cost-efficient, effective, and personalized way. And the result of that is allowing us to reach thousands of young people through school districts. Many of those are in regions that are under-resourced, understaffed, et cetera, and helping to support students in real time in ways that help to relate to them. And that combination of human and AI is I think really important in allowing us to do that in a way that works for the districts and the students that we support. And so the reason why I mentioned seven, or put seven on the scale is I do really believe, and we see it every day, like AI and even some of the organizations here who use it are making material impacts on young people's lives in education, whether that's because it's offering services in communities that just could have never accessed it otherwise, or making the cost such that it can be accessible for more and more people, but also in a way that's really hyper personalized to the individual needs of learners. So whether that's from diverse backgrounds or different education levels, different levels of emotional maturity, etc. And we're seeing the impacts of that with our product every day, but also just talking to different districts around the types of tools they're using. And so I truly believe, like, as you continue to look to scale these effective interventions that already exist, AI is going to be a huge enabler of that. But I didn't choose a 10 because I do continue to believe, that in-person connection, learning from people, connecting with people, whether that's teachers, family members, therapists, friends, et cetera, is an incredibly important part of it. And so, AI shouldn't be replacing people, but more as a force multiplier for human relationships and interventions in a way that expands equity of access and support for really effective tools. And so I'm a big optimist, but obviously still believe, there needs to be effective guardrails, a burden of proof for outcomes, as well as just continued need for that human connection as a part of the total package that we offer.
Thanks so much, Drew. Pretty good staying close to 2 minutes, Drew, and a little bit over, but I'll give everybody that
Okay.
grace. Drew, you want to choose the next person to introduce themselves and their number and why?
Sure. I'll go to Viv next.
Awesome. Thanks, Drew. Hey, everyone. I am Viv Ramakrishnan, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Project Read. And we build a suite of tools both for teachers and for students around reading instruction and specifically foundational literacy instruction. So that's in many cases phonemic awareness, phonics, literally decoding and reading the words on the page and reading them with enough accuracy and pace to be able to actually unlock all of your brain power to fully focus on comprehending what you just read. And those two things happen in tandem, but for many students, if they cannot decode the words on the page or cannot read passages fluently, even if they would have all the skill and capacity to understand and answer really nuanced questions about that passage if it was read aloud to them, if they can't do that themselves, it's a non-starter. And we know from all the research that students that can do this by third grade are on track to have much better outcomes both in the rest of their time in school and in life. And so we've really focused heavy on early literacy. The other thing I'll mention is that we've really embraced going bottoms up through teachers. So oftentimes I think tools require coordinating top down with districts or schools, and we have gone bottoms up through teachers, which I think has been a little unique. The reason why I went with a 4, I think there's a bunch of different ways I could have cut this question. The future of learning, the future of schooling, all learners who need it most. And I probably would have gone higher if it was solely on the impact of the tools themselves and the potential of personalizing learning. I think that I'm also deep in the weeds of what it means to implement these tools. And so for the same district, take two similar school districts demographically in the same state, using the same exact curriculum for all of our tools. They might have vastly different rates of usage, adoption, etc. And all of this relates to the deep human and systems challenge of doing this work. And AI will not solve that. In some ways, I think that it actually works against the trust that educators need to work meaningfully with these tools. So I took the approach of thinking about this not just through the lens of impact, that probably would have increased my rating, but also just being in really the throes of working with districts and understanding their unique context and what challenges they have for implementing the same technology, even holding constant all other factors on paper.
Thanks, Viv. You want to call on the next person?
Yes, I will go to Heejae.
Thanks, Viv. Hi, good to see everyone. So, my name is Heejae Lim, and I was the class of 2015, and I started Talking Points while I was at GSB. Still remember working on the idea in a couple of classes, like Startup Garage. So, Talking Points is an education technology nonprofit, and our mission is to drive student success by unlocking what we think is the superpower of families to fuel their children's learning. Research shows that family engagement is twice as predictive of student success than that family's wealth, but the means to do that well, there's a lot of barriers for both families and schools to engage with each other. So our goal is to kind of systematically reduce the barriers and guide schools and families in a research-based practices way. So Talking Points, transforms what we call a cell phone into an AI-driven tool that enables both two-way translated communication between families and schools across 150 languages. We coach schools and families to improve student outcomes and kind of provide actionable data to schools and districts, encouraging progress across the student outcomes. And last school year, we served about 9 million students, families, and educators across the country, working with hundreds of school districts. And we now have multiple rigorous research studies showing that Talking Points significantly improves math, reading proficiency, attendance, and behavioral outcomes with a disproportionate impact on traditionally underserved students, Black and Brown students, ELL students, special education students, and students in underserved communities. So I chose the number 7. And I chose the number adding on to a couple of points that were already mentioned because, I am an AI optimist. I think AI has a lot of potential in impacting education outcomes, but only if we're kind of operating in a container that is very intentional, deliberate, disciplined, and consistent about applying it both in the R&D phase, the research and development phase, as well as implementation of it, like Vivek mentioned. So I think of it definitely not as a cure-all, but it can accelerate a lot of learning and instruction if done well with all the caveats I mentioned. I think the caveats are kind of hard to stick to. I also didn't choose or go above the number 7 because I do see as powerful it is in improving the outcomes, I do see the worry and the fear of it potentially widening education outcomes between haves and the have-nots. And I just don't think yet we've seen the reality meet the vision of improving education outcomes. And, I kind of think about at the cusp of the internet age starting, if someone were to ask this question, would the internet solve all the problems in education? And I think, no one would go to a 10. I think of AI as it's a similar kind of revolution in technology, but that's all there is. So it's really around how we apply it and how we choose to apply it that really matter. So I think a lot of it is like we have the agency to shape it, but we do need to actively shape it to make it a 7 plus or even a 10. And I'm going to pass on to Abdulhamid.
Thanks, Heejae, and thanks, Amanda, for inviting me to this great panel. I'm Abdulhamid. I'm the founder of Darcel. I actually launched Darcel in my GSB dorm room. I was class of 2021 and launched with SIF as well. And Darcel is a global education technology nonprofit, and we're focused on improving math learning outcomes, working specifically with governments in low and middle income countries. So we've mostly worked in Jordan, India, and Nigeria. And our product is a WhatsApp chatbot that allows students to practice math from home, but practicing kind of curriculum aligned math. And we work very closely with public schools because math teachers are the ones that are telling students about Darcel, and they're the ones that are getting reports and continuously motivating them. So it is a tech solution, but kind of similar to some of the other panelists here, we're working very closely with government schools in order to implement it. And I went with the three, even though I'm a very kind of optimistic person about AI, and I'm kind of, quite happy that it's here. But I think, and I like a lot of what Viv said, AI is allowing us to build better tools, better quality content, new experiences, more personalization, and that's super important. But I think if there's kind of one big lesson from the last 15, 20 years of edtech, and they've been too many underwhelming years, it's that the tool is not enough. And it's only useful if you can get students to actually use it. And of course, you layer on top of that kind of the dimension of equity. And the challenge of getting usage to happen, both for teachers and for students, is a deeply kind of human and behavioral challenge. And so far, there's no real evidence to believe that AI can really move the needle too much on that. And I think we're still trying to figure out how to get students to use solutions that are effective. And we've had effective solutions for a long time, but we're definitely, like, I think as a sector, we've been much better at developing good tools than we have been at getting them to get adopted at the scale where they can actually have that impact. And for that reason, I think it's a three for me. And then of course, there is a big equity concern that where technology ends up getting adopted tends to be by students who already have the resources and or are already motivated. And I think left to its own devices, kind of technological advancement in this particular sector tends to exacerbate inequalities. So I think there's a lot of work that we have to do to better understand how to motivate usage in general, but also how to make sure that we can reverse the inequities that already exist and which the pandemic made much worse.
Thank you. We're so thankful to have all of you here, and it's exciting to hear the similarities and the differences in your approaches and your thinking. Abdulhamid, I want to direct one of the audience questions to you first to maybe kick off an answer. And for those of you in the audience, please use the Q&A function. It's really helpful for us to be able to track, and I'll do my best to integrate questions as we go. But this one is from Sushim. Forgive me if I said that incorrectly. In addition to technology innovation, what are the top policy and or funding enablers needed to leverage AI to improve educational outcomes and access? And so, Abdulhamid, because of your work with governments, maybe you can kick it off. Heejae, I'm positive you have things to say too, and then would love to hear from the others.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, macro picture, the kind of aid sector took a pretty big hit over the last year. And a lot of education funding in low-income countries went away. A lot of governments rely on kind of development resources especially for experimenting and kind of testing new solutions and implementing technology. And when that funding goes away, that is holding countries back and exacerbating inequity. So I think kind of big picture, I think there's a need for kind of doubling down on kind of financing to low and middle income countries to figure out solutions that work for them. Because very often it's not the same solutions that kind of work in California that you can kind of copy paste into these environments. But there's also a very big kind of policy challenge with kind of not challenge per se, but like the policy element of technology adoption, especially in like government schools, is so important. And for good reasons, I think a lot of education kind of ministries or districts are what you would call kind of laggards or kind of hesitant to adopt new things because there are risks when it comes to, especially, these are children at the end of the day. And with AI, there's lots of uncertainties. But this for me, I mean, it's a solvable problem if there's enough kind of true engagement with these stakeholders and kind of a design thinking approach where you're building solutions working with these governments and kind of with these local schools and with the teachers. And I don't think there's enough of that today. I think too much of the conversation is around, oh, this thing works, and then you have companies showing up, knocking on doors and saying, hey, we want to implement this here because kind of we did this test in the US and it works there, so we want to do this here. And I think that has been kind of part of the challenge. So I think there's kind of a higher willingness of engaging with government to begin with, I think is very important. And it's very nice that so many of us kind of here today are engaging with government, but that's not the norm. Actually, a lot of edtechs very explicitly steer away from working with government because it has its own challenges, and I think we need more of that engagement rather than less.
Thanks. Heejae, I'd love to hear if you have any different perspective, additional kind of new perspective, especially working in the US primarily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so I'm gonna actually park away policies around adopting AI because there's a lot of great conversations already being had. From my perspective, I think there are ecosystem enablers that can really push purchasing. So in our case, we work with school districts who are our customers. So I think a increasing policy environment that really encourages and incentivizes school districts and school systems in general to purchase on outcomes and evidence-based technologies is really going to move the R&D ecosystem in building products that are more consistent with producing equitable outcomes as opposed to it being just engaging and exciting, but without the promise of outcomes. So an example of that is outcomes-based contracting, which is gaining a lot of movement and momentum behind, so that the providers, education solution providers, and school districts are actually sharing kind of that incentive around providing outcomes. I think, in the nonprofit space, experimental funding is just in reality pretty limited, and AI is not, you're not developing in a waterfall way, like as it was done traditionally in terms of technology development. It requires a lot of iteration cycles to be able to move the needle and get to the right place. So I think philanthropic funding that really encourages experimental R&D to the extent that it gives the solution providers leeway and room both for time and effort, I think is going to be really important. And then lastly, if I think about adoption of AI and where it can be most well leveraged is around, analyzing data because we're all living in a very data rich but insight poor world. Having said that, these data sets are not publicly available. They're often owned by few monopolistic players who kind of are hoarding the data, frankly, right now. So anything that ecosystem players can do in terms of incentivizing open access to data sets or public data sets or sharing data, interoperability of the data, I think will really kind of encourage more innovation in leveraging AI to improve education access and outcomes.
Thanks so much, Heejae. So helpful to think about the government, both in like providing incentives, funding, in your case, as a payer for your nonprofit through district, level partnerships. Drew, something you said made me think we could bridge this into thinking about like government also can help provide guardrails. In your case, you're working in a pretty highly regulated kind of area where there's a lot of built-in protections already. And then I'm curious what you think about kind of guardrails, the barriers of the proof of outcome. Those are two things you mentioned in your intro. Can you talk a little bit more about like safety and risk as it relates to policy or just in general, your approach?
Yeah, I'd say, in some ways it is highly regulated, and in some ways it's still very much the Wild West at the moment, particularly as it relates to mental health and AI or not. So if you think about what's regulated, you have, first working with schools, FERPA, and then, if you're bridging the gap into healthcare, there's also the HIPAA consideration. And then if you're working with under the age of 13, there's COPPA considerations. And something that we at times find frustrating is there's actually inconsistencies, for example, with parental consent between those on how you might operate, and different schools might interpret them differently. And so that makes it, sometimes challenging. And, we've, put out some pieces around, how we can unify those things to make things easier. But I think as it relates to, AI for mental health and mental health for young people in particular, you saw the federal government try to do kind of like we are going to do the policy around this, and that got blocked. And now you've recently seen various states, California being the most recent, around, various regulations on, disclosure, or, what can be put in front of young people, what is the kind of reporting that needs to happen around it. Illinois banned the use of AI for therapy purposes. There's a whole like swath of companies that are doing wellness. So, non-clinical services that kind of thwart needing to do licensing or some of these regulations. And that's a bit of a gray area. There was an FDA kind of discussion that happened a couple of years ago around, or a couple of weeks ago, around how we might regulate those things as well. And so, to the points that were just previously mentioned, what tends to happen is you have kind of your innovators who are adopting the AI technologies at schools that are put in front of them. So the people with the best sales teams win in that type of situation. And then you have the folks that don't know how to assess these solutions. And frankly, it's pretty difficult unless you're doing this every single day. And that's really challenging because, and so a lot of it is like lack of adoption due to fear, because, you can hear some or see a pretty slide or some outcomes, but what does that actually mean, and how is that actually going to impact kids? And so I actually think having some sort of more clear regulatory framework would actually make it a lot easier for organizations approaching things the right way in order to kind of rise to the top or make progress more quickly, because there'll just be a better understanding across all stakeholders in terms of how to, assess these types of things, what we can do, what we can't do, what's right, what's not right, etc. And especially as we talk about mental health, I mean, many people here probably have heard some of or seen some of the headlines around, like, let's say, there was one recently in the New York Times about a young person that used ChatGPT and ChatGPT actually helped them draft a suicide note and figure it out how to hang themselves. And those are the types of things where, if there kind of was thoughtful design or kind of guardrails around how these tools could be used or not, those types of things could be avoided, or helping schools, for example, assess, and I even have a simple checklist on how to assess those types of tools. So I do think like the burden or onus, there needs to be some consistent structure, I guess, is my view, put in place specifically around young people and working in schools. And that will be both easier for companies, but then also just easier for schools and administrators to figure out like what makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's shift directions a tiny bit, and I'm going to try and merge a question I had planned and then one that we got from Varun in the Q&A. Viv, and I'd love to direct this at you. Like, what about human development and human relationships? You've been a teacher, you've worked directly with kids. Like, what do you worry about? What do you think about the path forward? And then to just flag a couple of the point that Varun Kota made, he asked whether there'll be more demand for providers of in-person experiences, like after school programs, summer programs, and so just I'm curious of your thoughts on that topic.
Those are all really good questions that I feel like I'm still trying to figure out my own views to. In terms of, the human relationship side, I think that, what Drew works on is, funnily enough, like kind of downstream of a lot of things we work on, because by the time kids get to adolescence, they, are a product of so many experiences they had early on. And so I think about our responsibility working largely in the elementary school space around, what do we try to solve that teachers currently struggle with? Like, this is an outgrowth of what I struggled with in the classroom, which was giving kids enough one-on-one feedback on literal skills that they need to develop. But I guess I'm optimistic, because the way we've thought about it is, how can we get kids one-on-one real-time feedback that's responsive to their needs? And I think AI portends very positively there. Ideally, it should also unlock time for teachers to do the things that they are hopefully really good at. First of which is like direct instruction up front. There's really good evidence for whole class direct instruction still. I don't think we should go to a world where we think all instruction is hyper-personalized and one-on-one. At least in the reading space, the space that I know best. But two, a lot of us got into this because of the relationships that we wanted to build with students. So as we think about building solutions, I think there's a lot of anxiety from teachers. Like they talk to us a lot about, are you building like with our student facing tools, something that is ultimately meant to replace us? And I totally get where that fear existentially comes from. And I think that there probably are a lot of founders who are intending to do exactly that, quite frankly, whether or not that's said publicly. I think for us, truly, we have built, I kind of think about what we've built in three buckets or a Venn diagram. We have teacher-facing tools that hopefully save time for teachers from things that they were previously doing super manually. We have student-facing tools that hopefully give that sort of one-on-one feedback that unlocks teachers to do more deep, meaningful relationship building with students. And then in the intersection of them is I think where like the magic is. And it's hard to build products that both save teachers time and move the needle for students. Like that's the magic middle where I think that we have one of our three products that I think would fit in that category. But all of which is to say, I mean, you can tell from my meandering answer, I'm all over the place and figuring this out in real time. But I hope we build tools that are not intended to replace teachers, but really amplify what they do best and fill in gaps in what they struggle with, which is that one-on-one feedback with each kid as much as they can give subsequent to direct instruction. And two, continue to build tools that respect and save their time and move the needle for students. Because I still think there's a ton of the AI meets education market is flooded with a ton of teacher widgets that are fun, but will never move student outcomes.
Thanks. Drew, Heejae, anybody else want to say something more about this topic? I'm thinking of the kind of human in the loop nature of your design, Drew, and then the way that parents and teachers are connecting, not just on text, but in real life. Heejae?
Trying to find the mute button there. I don't have a strong perspective around how AI will influence this kind of in-person programs market and out of school programs. However, I do think that at least in the US, the policy funding environment is changing fast, has already dramatically changed. So a lot of states are adopting education savings accounts, vouchers, school choice, and so on. So my perspective is that because of that policy change and pretty dramatic shifts, that will drive up the demand for in-person programs that is not necessarily AI based. Because the funding nature has changed, and now families and parents, frankly, just have a lot more choice than they did 3 years ago around how they would spend the kids' time and allocate the kids' time across different programs that also include non-traditional school models, like the ones that were listed in the question. So from that perspective, I do think that the market is growing, but I don't know how AI is necessarily impacting that.
Yeah, it's interesting, like particularly for what we do. I mean, you can draw some corollaries to like what happened with social media and the addiction and dependency that young people developed for those types of tools and still continue to develop for those types of platforms. And I think the fear, like particularly around products like ours that are chat based, we're not a chatbot, but we do have some elements of like engaging with someone digitally versus in-person connection. And then, we and others, schools, for example, do have fears around developing dependency there. And like a lot of the general purpose AI tools out there that exist are geared towards maximizing engagement. So how do you get someone to continue to engage, to come back, to get a dopamine hit in some way, shape, or form around that type of engagement? And we actually have to think a lot about, part of our goal often in conversations we're having with students is actually how do we get them to go engage with someone in person, have a difficult conversation, not feel like they have to come back. And so, it's like we think about something, or we call it healthy engagement, as opposed to like maximizing daily active users, because it would actually be a failure if we were seeing every single student and every single student school engaging every day. Like that probably is a sign and symptom of much bigger challenges that exist. And so, and there's lots of research out there that you can go into around like the connection between specifically like mental health and your feeling of personal connection with people in your life, not just, digital tools and things like that. And so it's something that we have to think an immense amount about. I think will continue to come up in, books like, some of Jonathan Haidt's that lots of folks are reading, have bringing this to the forefront as well, and brings it into conversation, which I think is a good thing, and is forcing, companies to really think about how do we avoid those types of situations.
Mm. This is making me think so. Oh, go ahead, Riv.
I was just going to piggyback real quick off of what Heejae mentioned, which is I think the policy landscape is shifting for sure, opening up more options for families to find supplemental uses of their dollars, or supplant their dollars and send their students to voucher schools, for example. I think the other thing that I see happening for our large public school systems that educate, I think, the students that demographically are most low income, highest percentage of minority students, is they're experiencing a crisis of enrollment. People are fleeing with their feet. They are moving to richer districts. They are they're shelling money out of pocket to go to private schools. And the reality is we have to acknowledge that the status quo of outcomes is driving that. It's not just the funding landscape. This report just came out on early literacy in Wisconsin that's mandated by the State Department of Education. And I'm here right now, so it's all top of mind. The beer is cold, the people are friendly, but the kids can't read. It's like 47% of kids in this state read below the 25th percentile nationally. And so you're seeing like this flood of parents out of large urban school districts to any other options they can find. And I think we can talk about tech or AI or policy accelerating that, but I think a lot of that is really more fundamental just to the fact that our students are not finding success in school, and it's finally catching up with parents.
Keeping it real, thank you. I mean, it's tragic and so important to be paying attention and responding. I wanted to ask a little bit about this question of outcomes, connecting some of what you're saying, Drew, and even you, Viv. It's like, if in the end, eyes on the tool, or repeat engagement is the measure, then it's going to incentivize like one way of building and designing. If you're defining your outcomes in a different way, which might be like, literacy success, or healthy, mental health, or success with math. I mean, maybe Abdulhamid, will you kick off a conversation talking about how you think about metrics, how you define your outcomes, and what kinds of standards you're holding yourself on to really own that like burden of proof, as Drew said earlier.
Yeah, I mean, we invest a lot in research and evaluation. We've done 3 RCTs so far. We are in the middle of 3 other RCTs right now, to try and kind of measure the impact of our learning. And one thing we really care about is kind of measuring it, kind of in aggregate. We're like, what happens if I introduce this to the school system, not just for the kind of kids who do end up electing to use it, but for the classroom as a whole. And even within the classroom, who are the students who do use it, and who are the ones who don't? And we still have a lot of work to do on this front, but the goal is kind of making sure that every student is using it, and we actually care more about the students who are kind of most struggling and kind of least incentivized, or least, motivated to use it. And I see this because I think it's a very important point when we're talking about kind of impact of education, kind of technology tools in general, where very often you will read about reports of, this great intervention had this massive impact, and then you read the fine print, and it's like, yeah, for the kids who got the proper usage, and for the ones who kind of did everything perfectly, and it's completely kind of, the evidence by design is not representative of like what it would look like at scale. And And I think that also creates a bit of the disconnect where we hear so much about edtech, being so impactful, and it can be in those right settings, but actually in many settings it just doesn't work very well. So I think as important as the question of like, can it work, is like, who can it actually work for? And are you able to create that impact under kind of scalable conditions? Meaning not when you are putting so many resources to make sure those 5 kids are going to use it. And can you make this work even for the students who are not kind of intrinsically motivated?
And Abdulhamid, you threw out like that you're, doing multiple RCTs as though it were a really easy thing to do, but generally, like early stage organizations, nonprofits, really struggle to kind of meet that standard of rigor in the types of studies that they do. Can you just talk a little bit about like how you approached it, why that was important to you, what it looked like to structure it? Heejae, I'd love for you to chime in too, because I know you've done really rigorous trials. And then if any of you have come up with like lighter lift ways to also have rigor and high standards for the way that you start out thinking about impact measurement, that would be great to hear about.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think what maybe the most important thing is kind of thinking about this from the beginning rather than let's go implementing and then implement something and then as an afterthought be like, okay, now let's try and measure. So we're very big on randomizing our rollouts. So when we're piloting something and introducing kind of a new program, we try whenever possible to have either at the school level or at the classroom level randomized access so that some students have it and others don't. And of course, this, it's not always the most trivial thing to do, and this has to be done in a close kind of collaboration with the government. So we have a lot of conversations with our partners on like why we want to do this and how to like offset some of the potential downsides. But if you're baking that into how you're rolling out and how you're kind of growing your program, you can get some pretty rigorous evidence early on. I'm not opposed to kind of these kind of large, massive budget RCTs, and we're doing one with JPAL as well right now. But early on, it was just these much smaller, cheaper kind of. It's almost like a kind of a. It's a big A/B test at some level. That's like as long as you can randomize in some way and measure outcomes in some robust way, you have evidence. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think having that evidence early on is super important.
I
For
can.
us, oh,
Yeah, sorry, Heejae,
go,
go ahead.
go on, Viv. Go,
No,
go. Um, yeah, I think just adding to that, I think we think about a portfolio of research studies that can kind of cross both the entire platform of users that's more generalizable. But I think, research is not just around does it work, does it not, which is essentially what an RCT will tell you. But it's who does it work for, under what context, and how does that differ in outcomes and why, around like really understanding the mechanisms, I think is even more important to be able to apply it to your next stage R&D. So that's how I kind of think about research and its function. We are doing a large scale RCT next school year. So, how that work came about was one of our philanthropic funders was, willing to fund the study because it can get expensive, both in terms of money and contracting a research agency and time and effort for the organization. But the layer just below the RCT that we've been pretty confident around the results, but doesn't require quite as much effort is what we call quasi-experimental studies. So it's kind of a tier 2. It gets quite highly technical, so you need to be able to have the right talent to be able to do that well. But it doesn't take, as much time or effort as a large scale RCT that will complement and supplement the results. Again, this kind of menu of research and thinking about it not as a what you do it once and kind of you leave it, but you need to continuously build on another as well.
Viv, you're up. Thank you,
I was
Heejae.
just going to say, I think there's this interesting tension also early on that I've always felt between a couple things that have always been true and a couple things that are particularly true now. So, what's always been true is that you kind of have to decide when to hit pause to do research sometimes when you feel confident that what you've built is actually worth studying and will have the sort of impact that you want to have on the students that you serve. So that's one, deciding when are we still building and when are we still molding the Play-Doh, and when do we hit pause and like let the controlled experimentation process play out with third-party researchers, et cetera. The other one, so that's always been true. The other thing, though, that I think is really interesting to navigate right now is the cost and speed of building is so different, or at least of prototyping is so different relative to what it's always been. I know Abdulhamid is deeply technical. I am quasi technical. I'm not deeply technical, but I like, just a really concrete example. We've been hearing from teachers and school leaders that they want a little bit more focus in our tutor for students that literally don't know their letter sound correspondences. D makes D, right? Not just word reading. So we've been trying to figure out how to go deep on that. I had a call with like our advisors at the University of Florida Literacy Institute that we work super closely with to kind of sketch out and show them what I'd vibe coded, right? And now I'm on the ground and I have personally administered 30 different pre-phonics assessments in the last day to different kids with different profiles, whether they have IEPs, multilingual learners, et cetera. And I'm like iterating with them every day. And I'm going to see how we do in a week from now and just see directionally. And it's how, and that is by no means the sort of RCT or even tier two quasi-experimental study. But before our real engineers invest the time and energy in building this into production, yes, we're building on a well-established research base, but I also want to get signal much faster from real kids on the ground with a mix of different backgrounds. And working closely with, the school that I'd previously helped start has been a huge advantage to that. But I think that founders can and should, if they can, try to find faster ways to get signal on if what they're doing actually works with kids in the field.
Thank you so much. That's a great segue into like another kind of body of topics around kind of the go-to-market. There are a couple of questions from the audience. One is about how do you establish trust when you're trying to put a new AI tool out there. Another one was like, should I go first to a private school because maybe it'll be, easier than like going through kind of public school systems. So I'm just wondering in general, this like, how do you get started? The first partnerships or the first time that you're putting your idea out to test it out, what are people doing right, and like what do people do wrong? Or in your own experience, what worked and what did you find to be less effective?
I can say a couple of things. I actually think, I personally learned a lot from observing the way Viv did it, which is literally going to somewhere where you can work with people who trust you as a person. And I think your first partners that you're going to get, they just need to like know you and trust that you're going to, work well with their kids and serve their needs and, be transparent with them and communicate and, try your best. And then actually going there and spending time with them and their students and seeing the outcomes and iterating and improving and listening to them, etc. And yeah, I think Viv does a particularly amazing job at that. It really comes down to, I think, in the early days, both the trust in you and your team, and then also just appropriately level setting with them. I think overselling in the early days is a way to get way behind the eight ball and burn a lot of your chances. If you're transparent about, hey, here's what I built, here's what we know so far, here's our hypothesis. We'd love to, get some feedback with some of your students and incorporate that, or teachers or whomever, and then make improvements. And, this is really co-developing with you, and that type of thing, I think is the right way to go in the early days. And way overselling, I think just leaves a bad taste in people's mouths, especially when you think about like your teachers and school administrators getting 100 emails a day from companies trying to sell them something. Like, you're going to have a very difficult time getting in by trying to do that when you're at the first step of a very long staircase.
Can I add something that is maybe especially important for kind of the audience members who are Stanford affiliated or current students? I think if you're going out there and you're saying, "Hey, I developed this at Stanford or with Stanford support," or like I was at Stanford, that kind of unlocks, it's a signal that can create trust. But I would also kind of I guess I want to stress the importance of like humility, because a lot of these kind of systems and like and Silicon Valley doesn't prepare you well for the realities of a public school teacher in a low-income setting, right? Whether that's, in California or kind of somewhere else in the world. So I think you need this combination of like, hey, like here are the reasons why you should trust me, and why I kind of know what I'm talking about. But I don't think that's like a replacement for the humility of saying, and like I want to work with you to really understand kind of what the reality is here, and so that we can kind of co-build something that actually works for you. I think that combination is super powerful. But I think very often government bureaucrats are talked at by folks who have built great technology and think that that's the solution. And frankly, there's a history of kind of um, without naming names, like big money coming in to save education, and then things fail miserably, right? So I think there's a yeah, there's just I think that humility and kind of true partnership is super important, and that also like helps kind of with the long-term trust, because a Stanford name can get you in the door, but then if you're not kind of meaningfully engaging, then it doesn't take you very far.
I would just add also, I think a willingness to delay gratification related to Stanford and like the venture ecosystem and Silicon Valley and the way it operates is people think that there's quick hits and exponential growth. And there can be, it's just far rarer in education, no matter the metric that you look at. And I think that whether it's going B2B or B2C, like the traditional business models, whether you're for profit or nonprofit, are very different in education. For us, I always had the goal of building this phonics tutor that students could read out loud to and listen to. And we spent like the first month doing that and co-developing it and doing all of that stuff. And we released it. And I needed to check myself when a bunch of teachers were like, hey, this is great and all, but I can tell that you're building some cool things for the students that we would love spun out as standalone tools for us. And building for teachers has now kind of become a mission that has always meant delaying gratification and resources on building the tutor, the thing that we thought we wanted. But I think it's taken more time. But now, as we build the tutor and keep building it, we have so many more teachers that can give us feedback. We can think about it less as a standalone tool and more about how it plugs into an existing teacher's workflow. So being willing to do this thing that I wasn't planning on, which was building teacher-facing tools, even though I was a teacher, ultimately, I think has led to, and this still is leading to much better outcomes on what I thought I was going to build originally, which was just the student-facing stuff.
Thank you. Kind of bridging together a couple other questions from the audience about like getting started, resources, mentors at Stanford, how you bridged from being kind of within, being a student to suddenly being ready to build something out in the world. And then we have many attendees who are our alumni. And so from the perspective of someone who's an investor or a donor, like, what kinds of resources, listening, mentorship were most catalytic to you in the kind of early stages of finding the right angle on the problem and getting out there and making what you're doing work. So yeah, to recap, like highlights from Stanford resources or other kind of catalytic infusions of opportunities, capital, people, mentorship that really made a difference early on.
I was lucky to meet one of my co-founders who was a DCI fellow at Stanford, John Danner, and was in the weeds with me building for the first 6 to 8 months of the company every day, and was transformative in how I thought about, impact thesis being scale times efficacy, but thinking about how you can actually reach teachers with low friction and get into as many classrooms as possible. That was really, shaped early on how I thought about building this beyond just the pedagogical side. And I believe he is co-teaching a course now at Stanford. It's like the Lean Launchpad for Education, which is a fairly new course. So I would highly encourage everybody to, if you are at the GSB or at Stanford, try to join that, because it wasn't around when I was there, but I benefited from what is now being taught in that class.
Thanks, Jeff.
I'll do a quick shout out to there's an Impact Ventures class taught by Russell Siegelman and Laura Hattendorf, which I think is fantastic. One of many classes, honestly, on impact that I took. I think for me, just the exposure to entrepreneurs in the impact space through some of these classes was highly appreciated, and also CSI. I think I had a lot of office hours, even like super early on, where I'd kind of walk in with an idea, and just having a thought partner on campus was grateful. So if you're not talking to CSI and kind of leveraging existing resources, it's a fantastic place to start.
Gosh, so many resources. For me, it was Gloria Lee's class, Entrepreneurship and Education. She was teaching for the first year while I was in my second year there. And Talking Points is now a case study. So it's really fun to go back and teach that class. And then the late Bill Meehan, who really, I think, encouraged me to make it a nonprofit, together with some of the judges actually at the SIF Fellowship interview day, who said, actually, at the time, VC funding was kind of all I knew because that's what GSB knows. And I think it was still in the early stage of impact investing. And some of the judges, like Jim Fruiterman, was like, you can make this a nonprofit, and that felt right to me. And then the SIF Fellowship, obviously. And then I also applied for the Echoing Green Fellowship while I was at GSB, which has really strong GSB connections as well. So I'm probably forgetting a lot more people because it's 10 years ago, but it really kind of launched off Talking Points as I was graduating.
Yeah, I plus one to almost everything that was mentioned there. I'd say thing in particular with CSI and Amanda and the rest of the team was just connecting dots to alumni, or just people connected to the Stanford community as well. And both just the insights from those, but also introductions, customers, etc. Along those lines, I think there's so many people connected to the community in one way, shape, or form. And then also like other founders. I mean, Viv and I will debrief, every so often around some of the challenges in building in education, but then also just talking to, other founders as well. I think, I think it's Scott Brady line around only making original mistakes. And I do think you can save so much time, heartache, disappointment by trying to learn from others. So, whether it's folks on the panel here or others trying to build in similar spaces. And then one kind of post-graduation one that I found particularly catalytic was there's an organization called Headstream Innovation. We were part of their accelerator and residency program. They're specifically focused on helping youth through education in mental and behavioral health. So a little bit niche or very niche in some ways, but I think finding, yes, a similar community trying to solve similar problems is particularly helpful for us, at least, because there's so many learnings to be had there.
Thank you so much, everybody. My goodness, time has flown. We have 1 minute left. Let's do a rapid wrap-up round. I hope we can continue this conversation, have a part two some other day. But will you share one thing that you were having fun using AI in your personal life, or as like a little personal productivity hack, just to end on a positive note? And for those of you in the audience, I just popped a feedback form in the chat and would very much appreciate your feedback. This is the first event of this nature that we've hosted from CSI, and we'd love to hear if it's something you'd like to see more of. Okay, can I cold call somebody to share like something that you're enjoying using AI for in your life? I'll start with TJ.
Right now, travel planning. I am looking for a place in the US that has all these criteria to go to for Christmas break with my family. And it's been really helpful for idea generation and meeting everyone's demands for what they'd like to do.
Thanks. Viv.
It's a specific tool that I use for both work and personal life, but Whisperflow, I don't really type anymore, and I get through my inbox a lot faster by just talking, and it has been a game changer for me. And so I use Whisperflow for all sorts of things.
Thank you. Abdulhamid.
Right. I don't have an answer, but instead I'm going to use my time to tell everyone who's listening that there's education needs more people trying to build cool solutions in AI. So if you're thinking about it, do it. It's hard, but it's worth it.
Thank you. Drew.
This is maybe less. I would use the fun one. Like I am using, I guess, AI to help plan my honeymoon right now, which I'm excited for. But on a more work-related note, I set up a bunch of different projects in ChatGPT, and like I can basically automate all of meeting prep. So you just put in like a specific template of what you're looking for in terms of output, put in like who you're meeting with and what organization they're from, and it'll output like a one pager, which just saves a lot of time on Googling and otherwise.
Great. Thank you deeply for sharing your precious time with all of us. We know that it means you're not, vibe coding or RCT directing or meeting with, the mysteries of education or all the amazing, important things that you do with your time. Thank you for trying to reach young people and learners and teachers to strengthen their ability to, uplift people and help them connect and learn and thrive. I'm very thankful for each of you and for all of you who joined. Thanks for joining, and hopefully we'll see you again another time. Bye, everybody. Thank you.